People in the 1960s knew Frank Sutton. He had a booming voice and often yelled at people as Sergeant Vince Carter, which made him one of the most memorable characters on TV. For millions of people, he was the perfect example of military discipline, a man who was always about to lose his temper. But behind that recognizable bark was a man who was battling with something much worse than a sitcom script. Frank had to deal with the stress of being renowned, the weight of not talking about his personal scars, and the stressful atmosphere that followed him onto the set of Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. for years. What he said at the conclusion of his career changed how fans saw him for good. A soldier in front of the camera, Frank Sutton had already fought in some very tough fights before he even stepped foot on a Hollywood soundstage. He didn't get renowned by going to auditions or reading scripts. He was resolved to serve his nation, nevertheless. When World War II started, Sutton intended to join the U.S. Marine Corps. He enjoyed how disciplined they were, how famous they were, and how the uniform made him feel like he was doing something good. The Marines seemed like the perfect place for a young man who wanted to be strong and follow the rules. But that perfect notion fell apart in an instant. When he signed up, he didn't pass the color vision test. That one disqualification meant he could never wear the uniform he wanted most. It hurt a lot for someone who admired the Marines. Many men would have given up, but Sutton's will was stronger than his disappointment. Instead, he joined the U.S. Army, where he was accepted and quickly deployed into the midst of war. He was dispatched to the Pacific Theater, which was one of the war's most dangerous battles. Many people who only knew Sutton as a TV comedian later on are still shocked that he fought in at least 14 distinct assault landings. This wasn't the resume of a pampered actor who was just waiting for his big break. It was the life of a strong soldier. In the steamy jungles and dangerous coasts of the Pacific, Sutton learned what it meant to be afraid and to stay alive. He had to deal with the idea that he could die every night. He kept going, nevertheless, with the other fighters. He won the Bronze Star for being brave and the Purple Heart for getting hurt in battle. Sutton didn't talk about the medals very much, even though they demonstrated that he had given up something. He didn't think of them as signs of grandeur. They made him think of times he had been through that most of his buddies hadn't. Years later, when asked if his stint in the military changed how he played Sergeant Carter on Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., Sutton gave a direct answer. "I can only recall how scared I was and how hard I tried to hide it." That one sentence tells us more than any polished press release ever could. His typical fury, the ranting, and the stiff body language. These weren't just jokes. They were memories of a soldier's life that came from remembering how to disguise fear with discipline and control. Sutton, on the other hand, never wanted to talk about his time in the Army. Friends assumed it was humility, the kind of soft modesty that soldiers his age often showed. Some individuals thought it was because the memories were too unpleasant to remember. No matter what happened, when he got home and graduated from Columbia University with honors in acting, it felt like his life was designed for anything other than fighting. But the truth was apparent. The battle had already changed him. Even whether he was on stage or TV, he couldn't shake the memories of his time in the military. They shaped every part, shout and frown. The soldier stayed with the actor. It basically stayed in the spotlight where it was easy to see and became Sergeant Carter. In 1964, CBS showed Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C., which was based on the Andy Griffith Show. As Gomer, Jim Nabors won over audiences with his goofy charm and wide-eyed innocence. It was a brilliant idea for a comic to put the character in the U.S. Marines. Frank Sutton is the gunnery sergeant, Vince Carter. He was the ideal opposite of Nabors' hapless recruit as soon as he marched onto the screen, red-faced and booming. Their connection changed right away. One man was all talk and power, and the other was naive and eternally hopeful. A lot of people thought Sutton wasn't acting at all because his performance was so natural and sharp. People felt Sutton was a lot like Carter in real life, loud, cranky, and usually angry. That erroneous assumption stayed with him throughout his career, keeping his more private and reserved side hidden. But for others watching at home, the chemistry between gentle Gomer and Sutton's volcanic Carter was too much to ignore. The show quickly became one of CBS's most successful comedies of the decade, with millions of people watching every week during its first season. But there was more going on than just laughing. Sutton was a perfectionist who treated every half-hour sitcom like it was live theater. He wanted the jokes to be humorous, the timing to be right, and the mood to be high. Neighbors, on the other hand, were more laid-back and easygoing. Sutton made him practice his lines over and again until he was sure he had them all down. Sutton played situations with a flow that felt natural. Over time, those differences caused complications. Crew members muttered about how furious Sutton was when the scenes went too far into slapstick or took too long. When the camera wasn't on, he usually didn't holler. It was much worse that he didn't say anything. Frank got angry, but he didn't show it. One producer claimed later, "You didn't want to be in the room when he stopped talking." By the fourth season, people who worked on the show noted that Sutton and Nabors only communicated to each other when the scripts told them to. When the cameras weren't filming, their relationship had become more distant and professional. The end of Gomer Pyle, and a shocking choice. Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. was still one of CBS's greatest shows toward the end of the 1960s. Frank Sutton and Jim Nabors were the stars of the sitcom for 5 seasons. They made people laugh and played off the popularity of military-themed comedies. But everything has to end, and in 1969, Nabors surprised the network by stating he was done. He wanted to perform on stage, sing, and do variety shows. The news was like the floor falling out from under Sutton, who had given so much of himself to Sergeant Carter. The bosses hurried to find a solution. CBS pitched a spin-off where Sergeant Carter, U.S.M.C, would be the primary character. Early drafts even had a new idea: introducing a black recruit who would always outsmart Carter, which would disrupt the basic formula. It appeared new when you wrote it down, but Sutton didn't want it at all. He was sick of the constant yelling, the one-dimensional authority figure, and the never-ending tip casting. He flat out said no. That refusal surprised the network, to CBS. Frank Sutton played Sergeant Carter, and the crowd wanted more. Sutton, on the other hand, wanted to leave. He had to prove to Hollywood and himself that he was more than just one role. That year, Sutton became a frequent sketch comedy actor on Jim Nabors' Hour instead of a drill sergeant. He needed it to stay alive. He could still work with his neighbors and have an audience, but he didn't have to wear the uniform that had become his prison. The network pressure and the Hour with the Jim Nabors. When the Jim Nabors Hour initially came on in 1969, people had high hopes for it. The idea incorporated music, amusing skits, and famous people, and it quickly became a hit. Ronnie Shell and Frank Sutton came back with their neighbors, as well as vocalist Karen Moraro, the Tony Morenti dancers, and the kids from the area. It was colorful, loud, and occasionally wild, but it worked. The show earned good ratings, and it looked like it might last for a long time, but things were getting tense in the back rooms of CBS. The executives were not thrilled that Sutton had said no to the Sergeant Carter spinoff. They also thought he didn't fit the format of the variety program. Sutton was a wonderful comedian, but he couldn't sing or dance, which made him stick out in a performance that was largely about music. CBS told the neighbors to get rid of him right away. The message was plain: you need to get rid of Sutton or the show will be in danger. They were shocked by how the neighbors reacted. He said no. Sutton's neighbors thought he was a loyal friend and a key part of his success, even though they didn't always agree on the set of Gomer Pyle. He wouldn't betray him to acquire more views or to make a network pleased. That choice has consequences. Even though the show worked well, the Jim Nabors Hour was discontinued after just 2 seasons in 1971. CBS said in public that getting rid of sitcoms with a country vibe, such as Mayberry RFD, The Beverly Hillbillies, and Green Acres, was the reason for its huge rural purge. People who worked there know what really happened. The network never forgave Sutton for saying no to the spinoff, and Nabors' refusal to leave him meant the show was dead. The cancellation was a double blow for Sutton. He had finally gotten away from Sergeant Carter, but something he couldn't control tugged him back down. It showed his neighbors that he was dedicated, but it also ended one of the best variety shows of its day. There was still the bond between the two guys, which had grown through laughter, tension, and finally defying a network that wanted to split them up. Tipcasting, calm years, and a lot of stress. After the Jim Nabors Hour ended in 1971, Frank Sutton had one of the roughest times in his career. People in the business still thought of him as Sergeant Carter, and nothing else seemed to work. Offers came in, but almost all of them were for the same type of character: angry sergeants, noisy bosses, and persons in command who yelled more than they talked. Sutton said no to most of these. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life acting like a joke of himself. He went back to the theater, where there were fewer people but more respect. He could be someone else on stage, not Carter. He was happy when he was in drama, especially when he had to be subtle instead than loud. People who saw him in these shows said he had changed. He was still fierce, but in ways that showed how deep he was instead of suppressing it. Even though this was a safe area, Sergeant Carter's shadow still trailed him. People who liked him uttered stuff like Gomer Pyle. People told him to yell like he did on TV, and kids said hello to him in public. When what started as flattery evolved into a penitentiary, his family witnessed how much it cost him. Sutton became more and more reclusive in the early 1970s. In his spare time, he read, studied, and spent quiet hours at home with his wife Toby and their kids. People who knew him well didn't think he was the noisy sergeant. He was smart and generally had a book in his hand. This was not at all like the person who made him famous. But the stress of being locked in one role, even though he felt he could do so much more, slowly wore him down. By 1974, Sutton seemed like he was getting a fragile piece. He was back on stage, away from the cameras and the stress of being on TV. In many ways, it was a new start, but fate had a cruel twist in store. The last curtain and secrets that had been kept for a long time. Frank Sutton went to Shreveport, Louisiana, on June 28, 1974, to work on the romantic comedy Love. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new story. During a break between shows, he went back to his dressing room. He dropped over a few minutes later because of a heart attack. He died when he was only 50.
Everyone was startled by how quickly it happened, even fans, coworkers, and his family, who had just seen him on stage a few hours ago, full of energy. The funeral was quiet, just like Sutton's life outside of work. There was no Hollywood glitz or press circus, just family and close friends. Jim Nabors, who was quite angry, issued out a short statement praising Sutton as a fantastic performer and a fine person. Even after he died, millions still thought of Sutton as Sergeant Carter. Most of the tributes were about the Marine who yelled, and only a handful were about the combat veteran, the scholar, or the stage performer who had been trying to get his identity back for years. For years, no one told the full story of Frank Sutton. An ancient audio interview from the early 1970s came back to life in 2023. People asked Sutton if he missed working on Gomer Pyle. After a long pause, he finally added, "I miss working. I miss doing something that other people care about, but the number of shows made me feel stuck. You know how some individuals become typecast? I became that kind." He added that even though he liked Jim Nabors, they were never close. We did things in a different way. We had different thoughts. Half the time I yelled because I was mad. Not at him, but at the job and how tiny it made everything seem. That one line made everything seem so small that it was terrible. He couldn't be anything else because he was famous for that role. But he dealt with it in his own quiet way. He handled the pressure with elegance, never becoming angry in public or abusing fans, even when it got worse. People still laugh at Sutton's violent reactions when Gomer Pyle U.S.M.C plays the same song again. But under all that hilarity is the story of a man who sacrificed everything to a job that never offered him anything back. He was safe because he didn't say anything, but what he said last was true. Frank Sutton was not the same person as Sergeant Carter. He was a hero in battle, a scholar, a husband, and a parent, yet he was stuck in the role of a soldier that he could never fully leave. Frank Sutton's story is more than just what happened on TV. It reminds us of how much fame costs and the struggles that go behind the scenes. What do you remember most about Sergeant Carter? Please leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories about famous people from Hollywood that you haven't heard before.